Well, of course, Ian doesn't need an introduction. I did get in trouble. I should point out that when we first put out the ad for the seminar, it did go out without indicating that Ian had returned to us as the director of the CCR. So I wanted to formally apologise to Ian and acknowledge that Ian has come back. She got lonely, having not been the director for some period of time, and begged, absolutely begged to come back. So I'll hand over to Ian and the presentation will now get.
Well, okay, thanks, Greg. And thanks for coming here, everyone. There are some kind of spots here that if you want to sit on the floor, I think that might actually be a nice thing for some people to do. Sorry about that. That's how it is. Right, okay, now this session really, the two papers are connected today, mine and David and Nathaniel's, because both are part of a special issue for the journal Continuum that we are preparing and that I am actually editing. And my presentation, and the issue overall title is something like Navigating Complexity. We are not quite sure yet whether this is going to be the title for the special issue, but certainly this is the title of my presentation today. And my presentation really is designed to be the introduction of that special issue. So all the articles in the special issue will be written by members of this center, and each of those articles will address the question of navigating complexity in more specific ways, but I myself will talk, because this is the introduction for the special issue, in a more general sense. And also to say something about why we are doing this special issue. The reason for it is to think about ways in which different kind of research projects conducted within this research center by different researchers might actually address at a more general level a common challenge, and that common challenge is what I call navigating complexity. So, okay, I think it's a truism now to say that we live in a world burdened by exceptionally complex and intractable problems. We say that often, and I think I don't have to mention the kinds of problems that we can all come up with, whether it's climate change, or whether it is the threat of so-called terrorism, or whether it's urban gridlock, or the healthcare costs and so on that are continually rising. All sorts of problems. There's many different scales at many different levels. They are experienced as very complex and intractable, so much so that I think it's fair to say that the experience of the world as complex is now very much part of the structure of feeling that we live with in the 21st century. What remains unclear, however, is how we should respond to this complexity in practice. How can we navigate the complex realities of our time and find effective solutions for managing them? And I put solutions in quotation marks here because it is all too evident that there are no ready-made solutions to most complex challenges that we are having in the contemporary world. And I would suggest then that if we think in terms of solutions, that can always only be a continuous and provisional and indefinite affair with uncertain and indeterminate outcomes. However, the reality of this complexity is difficult to communicate, let alone made palatable to the public at large. As Zaki Laidi argues, in this time of extraordinary global change, there is a need for politicians and other leaders to provide an interpretive framework, a coherent narrative, which enables people to make sense of the complexities of our world today and how they are impinged on their lives. As Leidy says, the complexification of the real creates the need for a simplification of its enunciation. This means that dealing with complexity requires a way of making it easier to handle, not least in the imagination. But developing simplifications should not be equated with being simplistic, as would be the case, for example, in populism. Populism, says Leidy, arises out of a total rejection of complexity and a desire to reduce it to simplistic issues. In the absence of a convincing story to make sense of the complexities of this world, populists seek to provide reassurance by providing easy answers and by disregarding the ambiguities and paradoxes which typify complex realities. This means that we should see simplification as a necessary but never a definitive way of dealing with complexity. Yes, simplification is enabling. It allows us to contain the complex and to act on it. However, it provides only a temporary relief from the paralysing effects of complexity. As Anne-Marie Moll and John Law observe, simplifications that reduce a complex reality to a simple scheme tend to forget about the complex, but the latter may reappear later as a surprising or disturbing element that could not be fit into the simple scheme. Thus, rather than imposing an absolute simplicity, as in the case of being simplistic, simplification is part of an ongoing process. While being simplistic is tantamount to a reductionism which dispenses with complexity, simplification allows us to plot a course through complexity. Indeed, contemporary societies are awash with simplifying mechanisms designed to navigate the multiplying complexities of modern life. The point here is not simply to reject or denounce simplifications, but to examine how they work as more or less effective ways of handling complex realities. And indeed, there is actually an opposite story to be told here, that sometimes simplifications can make the world too simple, right? In which case, making it more complex would actually make things more manageable. But that's a different issue, and I think maybe at the end we can talk about that. So the question is, how does one simplify without being simplistic? And I would suggest that this, for us anyway, in this center, is an empirical question, right? It is a question to be asked within the context of particular problems or challenges occurring in particular instances of social practice. And that's what each of the articles in this special issue of Continuum is going to address, and David and Nathaniel's paper is going to be one of those articles. Now, my interest here then is to promote a cultural research that goes beyond deconstructive cultural critique and engages with the real world need for dealing with complexity by contributing to what I want to call cultural intelligence, and I will return to what I mean by that at the end of this presentation. Okay, now metaphors of complexity have been influential for some time in scholarly discourse, and most visibly, of course, in the guise of what we know as complexity theory. And complexity theory is really a range of scientific theories which stress principles of non-linearity, unpredictability, and self-organization in the way systems work. And it is really a more generalized and broader version of chaos theory, which describes the world as complex to the extent that it consists of always changing, unstable, and dynamic systems, where there is no consistent relationship between different elements, and where the whole has emergent properties which make it always larger than the sum of the parts. Interactions between parts may produce unpredictable effects, which, however small, may lead to massive changes in the future. There is no necessary proportionality nor simple linearity between causes and effects. Now, all those ideas which have become known to us through complexity theory, I think, have become quite familiar by now, right? And there is a radically anti-positivist principle here at work that has struck a chord. By the late 20th century, concepts such as strange attractors, emergence, nonlinearity, the butterfly effect, and the idea of living at the edge of chaos have become a popular vocabulary far beyond the world of science. It has been really avidly used in narrative devices in popular culture, for example, in The Simpsons or in Jurassic Park. But it has also been adopted in quite a lot of social science and humanities scholarship. And I think Bob Hodge, of course, has pioneered a lot of this amongst ourselves. And a book by John Arry, Global Complexity, 2003, perhaps is one that you can look at. More generally, I would suggest that there has been a much wider complexity turn in scholarly discourse, where conceptual and methodological trends have increasingly, in various ways, revolted against simplification and sought to capture the complex. And cultural research, or more specifically cultural studies, has been very much part of this trend. To understand this, let's take a step back and start with a simple description of complexity. Okay, so, and this is from Anne-Marie Moll and John Law. They say this: there is complexity if things relate but don't add up, if events occur but not within the processes of linear time, and if phenomena share a space but cannot be mapped in terms of a single set of three-dimensional coordinates. I personally think that that's quite a neat and concise description of complexity, to the extent that neatness and conciseness, of course, can be tidied up in a complex world. However, I think a few things we can take from this description, namely that in the complexity turn, there is an emphasis on irreducible multiplicity, there is an emphasis on simultaneity, many different things happening at the same time, and as a consequence, there is an emphasis on what I would call the logic of both and, right, rather than either or. So it's not mutually exclusive things, but things happening at the same time, the logic of both and. Obviously, this kind of thinking is fundamental in a resolutely post-positivist or anti-positivist field, such as cultural studies. It is intrinsic to what may be called a cultural studies or cultural research sensibility. And it may in fact partly explain cultural studies' rapid rise in global popularity from the 1980s onwards. When I myself was first attracted by the now legendary work of the Birmingham Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies almost 30 years ago, I was drawn particularly to this sensibility, a sense that the phenomena we seek to understand are always more complex than what positivist science claims to be the truth. Hence, I did feel an epiphany when, and I have told this story earlier, an anecdote really, when I came across a book by Raymond Williams when I was a student of communication and media studies in Amsterdam and tried to study Dallas, right, at that time. And there was this little book by Raymond Williams that I came across in a bookstore, Television, Technology, and Cultural Form. Now, when I look back at this, why was it that it spoke to me so much? It is that word "and," right? That is to say, in the title of this book, Williams emphasizes that television is both a technology and a cultural form, which really is an explicit doubling of perspective, which allowed for analytical approaches that treated television as a complex, multidimensional phenomenon with multiple meanings. Indeed, as I have argued elsewhere, cultural studies can be described as a knowledge practice centrally concerned with the complexities of the relations between culture and society, or more simply, with cultural complexity. Now, there is little direct engagement with complexity theory in cultural studies, but some of the most important critical theoretical underpinnings of cultural studies theorizing in the past 3 decades bear its concern with complexity out. For example, we have the post-structuralist understanding of the subject as the complex intersection of multiple situated and shifting subject positions. These are all theoretical pronouncements that we work with, right? There is the anti-essentialist emphasis on identity as always constructed in relation, like at the kind of juncture of the relation between self and other, for example. But there is also the post-colonial emphasis on hybridity and on third space, which unsettles the divide between sameness and difference. There's also the Foucauldian notion of power knowledge as dispersed and capillary, which really complexifies the idea of power. Then there is the Derridean idea of meaning as determined by a context that is never absolutely fixed and therefore never fully captured. And there is also the redefinition of society by Bruno Latour from a distinct entity to an endless trail of association of heterogeneous elements. Now, all these critical theoretical perspectives are arguably manifestations of a broad complexity turn. And this insistence on complexity has become a commonplace habit of thought, in my view, in cultural studies, in cultural research, and in the humanities and social sciences more generally. And we would say, of course, that, and I completely agree with this, that this turn towards seeing the complexity of things is really a theoretical advance and makes kind of our understanding of complex realities more astute. However, there is a counterpoint to this, and that has been articulated by historian Russell Jacoby, who contends that there is a devotion to complexity in the academic humanities today, and he is not altogether happy with this. He observes how often the stated intent of scholarly papers or presentations in the conference circuit is now, the intent is to make things more complex rather than to clarify, right? To complicate matters. So he asks whether there is not an unhealthy complexity worship. He says, we celebrate the fact that everything can be problematized. We rejoice in discarding binary approaches. We applaud ourselves for recognizing once again that everything varies by circumstances. We revel in complexity. Now, what he calls the cult of complication here is amply detectable in cultural studies. Our inclination to problematize, to contextualize, to relativize, to particularize, in short, to complexify, to denounce everything that seems reductionist or essentialist, to reject all binary oppositions in favor of the blurring of boundaries, to replace unitary identities with multiplicities, to be suspicious of notions of coherence and homogeneity, to pluralize everything which used to be talked about in the singular, right? For example, truth is not truth, reality is realities, and of course complexity is now complexities. Now, the routinized use of all these discursive proclivities suggests that the pursuit of complexity has become often an end in itself in much cultural research today. But, as Jacobi asks, shouldn't scholarship seek to clarify, illuminate, or egad, simplify, not complicate? How did the act of complicating become a virtue? Now, of course, this is more kind of like a kind of provocative question, but when thinking about it, you can really come up with some examples where this is indeed the case. And certainly that experience that he described, that when you go to conferences and you hear a paper, people start like, my intention in this paper is to complexify our understanding of this or that, right? I mean, that is kind of a very common way in which people actually formulate the purpose or the aim of a particular presentation. Now, a small example is the common critical impulse in cultural studies to be suspicious of facts, right? Facts often then, of course, put between quotation marks. I mean, the complexity turn really can be also observed in the ways in which a lot of presenters often use this, you know, kind of facts. Of course, we put quotation marks between particular words that we want to problematize. Now, to be suspicious of facts, and of course we would then expose them as social constructions. But there is an irony here, and again we can go to Bruno Latour, who has pointed out, and here he refers to his own theory of the construction of facts, which he relates that there is always that the construction of facts is based on lack of scientific certainty, and therefore always unstable, and so on and so on. However, he says that in the current global controversy over climate change, such a strategy of complexification is problematic because it can give fuel to the climate change deniers, who, and I quote Latour here, are using this very same argument of social construction to destroy hard-won evidence that could save our lives, unquote. So for Latour, this turn of events reinforces his worry that the political intellectual project of critique has run out of steam. Now, the argument here is not that we should return to the linear reductionism of positivism, but that it is not enough for scholars to revel in the complexity of things or even to demonstrate the complexity of things. There is no denying that the world is complex, but the recognition of this complexity in both the political and the academic realms cannot be left hanging. We have to move beyond critique and therefore beyond complexity. Complexity is not the message, or at least it should not be the only message. What this means is that as cultural researchers, we need to do more than articulating how things are complex, contradictory, and so on. What we should also aspire to, as part of our research endeavor, is to explore what kind of simplifications we need in order to cope or deal with or navigate the concrete, complex realities we are confronted with. While scholars may relish in complexity, living in a complex world where complexity rules is not easy. Such a world is ravaged by messy problems which are crying out for some solution, but for which there are no simple answers. Jake Chapman, who is more kind of a policy advisor, really, makes a distinction between two broad classes of problems: difficulties and messes. Difficulties are bounded problems about which there is a broad agreement about the nature of the problem and some accepted understanding of its possible solution. Here, a linear model of simplification which gets to the core of the problem would prove effective to solve it. For example, when your car breaks down, you try to find the faulty part and replace it. In the case of messes, on the other hand, there is rarely agreement about where the problem actually lies or where improvements might best be made, and they are subject to high levels of uncertainty. Messy problems are unbounded problems in terms of the time and resources they could absorb, the scope of inquiry needed to understand them, and the number of people who might need to get involved in dealing with that particular problem. In other words, messes are inherently complex in the sense that we can never fully pin down exactly what the problem is or where the problem is. Now, of course, and Chapman admits this binary distinction, and again here I'm trying to make things more complex, this binary distinction between difficulties and messes is too simplistic. In practice, most problems fall between these two extremes. Nevertheless, it is clear that many of the problems we are faced with in the world today are very messy. Climate change is perhaps one of the most dramatic examples of such a messy problem. As Chapman points out, such messy problems lead to intractable policy controversies, where achieving a consensus on how to address the problem is dauntingly hard. Indeed, there is a pervasive sense of impasse and paralysis in relation to what to do about a problem or a challenge, such as climate change. In short, if we experience our contemporary world as exceedingly complex, it is because we feel submerged in a proliferation of escalating messes, a world of seemingly irresolvable, uncontrollable problems. It is in the face of this common social experience that we should caution against a wholesale celebration of complexity. You might ask, might the world not have become too complex? Indeed, we do read things in the paper regularly, like, for example, this quote from Professor Ross Garnaut, who was the climate change advisor to former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd. He expressed his pessimism about finding a solution for climate change. Thus, it's too complex, he says. The special interests are too numerous, powerful, and intense. Another example is the 2008 global financial crisis. As widely reported, one trigger for the crisis was that the global financial system had become so complex, as indicated by the arrival of highly intricate financial products such as credit default swaps in the financial markets in the 2000s, that Wall Street traders and bank executives barely understood the real-world implications of their actions. As a newspaper article in the International Herald Tribune summed it up, complexity of trading overwhelmed traders. And that was in 2008. And of course, you can say many more things about the global financial crisis, but certainly complexity was one of the elements in understanding why and how it happened. So these examples suggest that complexity can be a decidedly negative thing in human societies. Now, this insight it puts really a darker shade on the cultural significance of the complexity term in contemporary discourse, right? And I said earlier that the complexity turn has given us more instruments, conceptual instruments to understand the complex world today. And we feel that that's an empowering thing. But at the same time, I think there is also kind of a disempowering thing about it. Nigel Thrift sees the new structural feeling of complexity as the sign, in fact, and he's a more kind of sees this in an optimistic sense. He sees the complexity structural feeling as the sign of a new sense of time, right? Involving a much greater sense of openness and possibility about the future. This, I would suggest, is an optimistic reading, suggesting that awareness and acceptance of complexity, with its recognition of the world as a complex assemblage of shifting and tangled diversities, multiplicities, indeterminacies, and so on, is a cosmopolitanizing sign, the mark of a growing cosmopolitan imagination, which can presumably contribute to a thriving and harmonious, inclusive, global human future. However, this hopeful perspective should be juxtaposed with the much more dismal experience of complexity as a paralysing and incapacitating state of affairs. When things are too complex, then, we need simplifications in order to move forward. And I have something to say about that move forward thing, by the way. Kind of the more I think about it, everyone was so disparaging when Julia Gillard came up with that kind of, moving forward as her slogan. But I thought, why is everyone so disparaging about this? Because in a way, that was the sensible thing to say to get out of a mess, right? So, kind of the question, of course, how you do it. But in a way, there was at that point no further horizon than just moving forward. So, what I have suggested throughout this talk is that the task is two-pronged. On the one hand, it requires us to take complexity seriously as an inherent and irreducible feature of reality. And we need to develop theoretically and empirically sophisticated ways of articulating that complexity in particular contexts. Right? On the other hand, we also need to formulate, or at least contribute to that formulation, ways of navigating this complexity through appropriate modes of conceptual and discursive simplification. Okay. One thing is certain, complexity is no longer a revolutionary idea, it is now a mainstream concern. For example, for IBM's, the large company, did a report last year capitalizing on complexity, and for this report 1,500 CEOs, general managers and public sector leaders from around the world were interviewed on their most pressing challenges in the current global environment. And the study identified one primary challenge, namely complexity. Interestingly, many of these corporate leaders and bureaucrats told the researchers that they were uncertain whether they would actually be able to manage this complexity, which they only saw as rising in the coming years. At the same time, the report says organizations that manage to capitalize on complexity prove to be the most successful in reaching their goals. The question, of course, what that means. The single most important capacity needed to find an effective path through this complexity, according to the report, is creativity. And this is from the report. Amongst others, it says that the first of the complex situations today, what is needed is creative solutions rather than rigorous or disciplined solutions, right? So what has become a more important leadership quality is creativity rather than management discipline, rigor, or operational acumen. Now, this corporate embrace of creativity as the key solution to managing complexity demonstrates that the recent enthusiasm for creativity, for example, in all the interest in the creative industries, as Pratt and Jeff could argue, needs to be put in context and in particular connected to strategic responses to competitive and globalized challenges in the contemporary economy. Creativity here is associated with operational dexterity and lateral thinking, with a flair for experimentation, a willingness to innovate and take risks. Creativity, in short, purports the capacity for cultural improvisation in circumstances beyond our control and prediction, where there are no fixed recipes for action. Importantly then, creativity seems to rise in use value in conditions of complexity, precisely because deterministic knowledges do not work very well here. In this sense, creativity is a crucial element in what I call, for want of a better phrase, cultural intelligence. Cultural intelligence should not be reduced to an individual capability, a psychological competence which can be acquired through, and there are actually books like this, how-to courses and guidelines, how to become more culturally intelligent. Instead, I propose to conceptualize cultural intelligence as an orientation to knowledge and understanding which goes beyond cultural critique through a practical engagement with complexity. The term intelligence is suggestive here because of its general meaning, and I get this from the dictionary, as an ability to comprehend, and to understand and profit from experience. But also for its more purposive meaning of the gathering of useful, often covert, unofficial or contingent information to assist in strategic decision-making as in an intelligence operation. Intelligence here connotes the calculated pursuit of knowledge required to act in circumscribed, tricky, and precarious contexts. This always involves modes of strategic simplification in that the knowledge produced must provide pointers for action. In this regard, intelligent knowledge is bound to be highly selective and contextualized, framing complex situations and messy problems in ways that will empower us to find pathways through them. I call this orientation to knowledge cultural intelligence to stress the constitutive role of culture in our efforts in making sense of and dealing with complexity. That is, complexity is always also cultural complexity, to the extent that the complexity of things, whether this is problems or events or practices or institutions or systems, is generated precisely, at least in part, by the multiplicity of meanings and perspectives which continually work to shape and reshape their shifting and contested configurations. Central here, of course, and you can hear this echoing, is the well-known cultural studies conceptualization of culture, namely that it is not a fixed entity, but an ongoing social process of meaning-making underpinning the constitution of society. To put it succinctly, cultural intelligence involves the recognition that navigating complexity can never be a question of definitive or one-size-fits-all solutions. Instead, it favors a more process-oriented approach to problem solving, based on emergent creative strategies of simplification which keep room for contingency and variability along the way, rather than based on, focused on predetermined linear goals and formulas. In this way, cultural intelligence can be seen as the practical application of complexity thinking. But in the process, it also goes beyond the critical affirmation of complexity as such. It proposes tools for navigating that complexity, while at the same time fully cognizant that the complexity of the world will persist irrespective of the simplifications imposed on it. Thank you.
Thank you.